Welcome back, brothers. This is our 9th video in our church history course, and today we are continuing with the discussion of the relationship between church and state. This is our 2nd video in that series. When last we met, we were talking about the way in which what I've called the Christendom model flourished for the most part in the Middle Ages, at least within the territory of the former Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and so forth. The story gets much more complicated and in some ways more interesting as we move into the 16th century and the period of the Reformation. And the reason that I say that is because although that Christendom model had functioned fairly well during the Middle Ages, with the popes having basically more power than any of the secular rulers who wielded the temporal sword. Nevertheless, by the time that Luther begins to come along, we have a different situation. Luther developed in his own theology a different understanding of the relationship between the spiritual and the temporal power. And that's basically because Luther had to refute the papal claim that he held all spiritual and temporal power as the vicar of Christ. He had to be able to make that argument. Otherwise, there was no way that his Reformation could continue. After 1521, he was excommunicated by the Pope, and at least according to the Pope's reckoning, he was outside of the church. Here, what he's going to do is articulate a doctrine that allows for a different sort of relationship between the secular rulers and religious powers between the church. I want to try and talk about his doctrine of the two kingdoms in basically 3 different ways, right? So I think there are kind of 3 different pieces of it, and if we take them apart, it's probably a little bit easier to understand. So the first part of his doctrine of the two kingdoms is basically a development of Augustine's theology. Augustine had written this very, very important and influential book. He wrote this over 13 years, between 413 and 426, so this was towards the end of his life, a book called The City of God. The City of God. And in The City of God, what Augustine basically did was he wrote the story of all of history from the perspective of 2 cities. Right? There were, in his understanding, 2 cities, and the city here is sort of metaphorical, right? It's not simply 2 cities, but 2 different ways of life, 2 different groups of people, 2 different ways of interacting. And those 2 different groups were basically those who serve God and those who serve the devil. Those who serve God are part of what he called the city of God. Those who serve the devil in their own ends are part of what he called the city of man. Now, the kingdom of Christ is the city of God. The kingdom of this world is the city of man. Both of these 2 cities have different ends, right? One moves towards glory, one moves towards destruction. But in this age, in this time before the coming of the new heavens and the new earth, these 2 cities are mixed with one another. So we rise and fall together. So even though we belong to the city of God, we find ourselves experiencing the same ups and downs as those who live within the city of man. Okay, so that's stream number 1 that Luther is developing. The second way that Luther talked was that he talked about 2 types of governments, 2 cities, now 2 types of governments. He said there are governments which are coercive. These are governments by the sword, right? And what they are to do is to use physical pressure to maintain peace and basic justice within the world. This is similar to what in the Middle Ages they would have talked about in terms of the temporal sword, right? That's what he's talking about here. Coercive governments who use the sword to maintain peace and basic justice in the world. These are good, right? Luther likes this. He wants there to be peace. He wants there to be basic justice within the world so that the gospel can spread. On the other hand, there's another kind of government, and this is also good. This is the spiritual government, the government of the church. And it is not government by the sword, by the temporal sword. Instead, it's government by the word and spirit. And by the word and spirit, the people of God are shepherded and they're gathered together into Christ's kingdom. So here we go. 2 cities, two governments, and now a third stream. He speaks in terms of two different realms. There is, on the one hand, the outward physical realm, the realm of the body, but then there's also the inward realm of the soul. And for Luther, all three of these elements are packed into his doctrine of the two kingdom, which helps him to understand how he thinks that Christians are called to live in this world. Because Christians are called, he says, to live in both kingdoms. Both kingdoms. They're called to live as citizens both of the kingdom physically within which they find themselves living, and also as citizens of the city of God, the kingdom that is to come. They're called to live in love to their neighbors and servants as servants of Christ in this world. But this also meant that because both of those kingdoms are under the authority of Christ, that it is the responsibility of each member of that kingdom to work towards good ends, that is, towards godly ends. And so he encouraged magistrates, godly magistrates, to act as what he called emergency bishops, right? If the local bishops are not doing what they should be doing in terms of reforming the church, he told the magistrates they should become bishops. They should unthrone, they should get rid of the evil, wicked bishops, and they should act as bishops in their stead in order to reform and to protect the church. So he is encouraging secular rulers to step in and take steps as religious authorities. The people, by contrast, so that is how the magistrates are supposed to act in the current situation. By contrast, Luther is very clear about the role of the people. The people are to respond with obedience and submission to their godly magistrates. Right? Luther is very, very clear on this issue, and it's important for him. He's very clear on this issue that lay people, common people, are meant to respond with obedience and submission to their godly magistrates. And the reason why he is so strong on this issue is that early on in the Reformation period, there is a great revolution that occurs, an uprising. A peasant's rebellion or a peasant's war. And many of these peasants who were terribly oppressed by their magistrates, taxed, forced to work long hours without payment, oppressed in all sorts of different ways. These peasants heard Luther preaching, or at least they heard people preaching about what Luther had been preaching. And they said, Luther talks about the freedom of the Christian, that all Christians are free before God, that no one is a servant. They heard Luther talking about the priesthood of all believers, that there is no special set-apart group of people who are holier than the others, but that all people who believe in Christ and have placed their faith in him, all of them are priests before God. When they heard that message of true equality, spiritual equality before God, when they heard that, they said, why then are we being oppressed like this? Why is it that that magistrates and nobles are treating us as though we were lower than them? This isn't right. And so they rose up in rebellion. Luther responded by saying, no, you have misunderstood me. He said, yes, of course, the magistrates ought to be kind. They ought to be good. They shouldn't oppress you. That is wrong. But you do not have the right to rise up against your authorities. Eventually, Luther wrote what he called the harsh letter. And in the harsh letter, he actually encouraged those nobles to go and kill the rebels, to cut them down. They did not have the right to rebel against the authorities that God had put in place above them, no matter how oppressive or belligerent they were. Well, in light of that, Luther was always going to emphasize the authority of the magistrates. And you may say, well, following the lead of a godly magistrate is one thing, But what about following the lead of magistrates who were not godly, who instead of telling their people to implement reform, to move in the direction of justification by faith alone and the solas of the Reformation, what if instead of that, you're being led by a ruler who says, no, go back to Rome, right? Go back to Rome. And in fact, at the highest level within Luther's territory, this is absolutely the case. Because while Luther's own lord, a man named Frederick the Wise, the Duke of Saxony, the Elector of Saxony, while Frederick the Wise agreed with Luther theologically, the man who was in authority over Frederick was the Emperor, Charles V. And Charles V was a strong Roman Catholic. He did not want Protestantism within his domains. And so how does Luther justify obeying Frederick but disobeying a higher authority? Well, later Lutherans would develop a doctrine which they called the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. And this is a very interesting development. The reason, what they do is they make a careful reading of Romans chapter 13. And at the beginning of Romans chapter 13, here we get one of the great passages in the New Testament calling us to obedience, right? Calling us to obey the governing authorities, as Paul puts it there. But what these Lutheran readers call attention to is the fact that it does not say obey the governing authority, right? That is the highest authority, but instead it recognizes that there's a multiplicity, perhaps a variety of different authorities who have been placed over the Christian, right? Who have been given authority or power over him. And they further say, in some states, the Constitution, that is the political settlement, the way things are done politically in that area, the Constitution allows for lesser magistrates to actually limit the authority, to challenge the authority of the supreme magistrate. And they say, oh, that happens to be the case in our territory, in the Holy Roman Empire. Within the Holy Roman Empire, there were 7 special nobles. 7 special nobles. These were known as the 7 electors. And these 7 electors were men of highest office. There were several archbishops among their number, several dukes and princes, even a king among their numbers. And these 7 men elected the emperor. When the emperor died, they got together and they elected the next emperor. Usually, they would elect the man that the previous emperor had chosen, usually his son or his nephew or his grandson or something like that. But theoretically, at least, they could elect someone else. Now, follow the logic. If these 7 electors make the emperor, then don't they have authority over the emperor? Isn't that the whole point, right? So these 7 electors act as a kind of higher authority than the emperor himself. And that means that they have the authority to resist his will. And therefore, it is legitimate for Christians, that is Protestants, to resist the emperor, not oppose him, right? Not rebel against him, but resist his will as long as they are following the will of an elector, which was possible. You can imagine, of course, that while this is, they may well be right in their reading of Romans 13, but you can imagine that this would lead to incredible political tension. Because now you begin to have a Holy Roman Empire which is divided up religiously. Now, many of the nobles, not just electors, but nobles throughout the Holy Roman Empire, were actually drawn towards this Lutheran idea of magistrates as emergency bishops, of magistrates as having a sort of authority over the church. And as a result of that, more and more of them moved towards Protestantism. And this created a divided Germany, a divided Holy Roman Empire. In the 1530s, Protestant nobles banded together. They joined what they called the Schmalkaldic League, a league of Protestant princes, just in case, right? Just in case some sort of trouble came in the future. We want to be together. We want to have some sort of union. And sure enough, in the 1540s, a war broke out. A war between, on the one hand, those nobles involved in the Schmalkaldic League, and on the other hand, the Holy Roman Emperor and the nobles who remained within the Roman Catholic Church and loyal to the emperor. This war became known as the Schmalkaldic War, and it was fought. It was a challenging war. Initially, the Protestants were thoroughly beaten. Eventually, the Protestants in the 1550s were able to push back, and for a time even pushed Charles, the Emperor Charles, out of the Holy Roman Empire. He had to retreat down into Italy. It was very embarrassing for him. And finally, they were able to force the Holy Roman Emperor to agree to what was known as the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Now, the Peace of Augsburg is one of those seminal, important moments in history because it sets the course for much of what happens in the future. Now, before I explain it, it is important to note that this was actually provisional. Right? The idea was that here we are, 1555, we fought these wars, we don't want to fight any more wars, so let's try and figure out a temporary solution to this problem of religious disagreement. Right? Let's create a temporary solution so that when there is a great council that is called, and that council decides on what the true version of Christianity is, then everything will become clear, right? But until then, let's just stop killing each other, right? So the Peace of Augsburg created a kind of legislation that basically said, whoever your noble is within the Holy Roman Empire, whoever your noble is, your nobleman, you're the person in authority over you, whoever that person is, he's the one who gets to decide what the religion is for his region. So if you are within the territory of the Duke of Bavaria, then you have to be a Roman Catholic, no matter what. If you happen to be within the territory of Luther's Duke, of Duke Frederick, then you have to be a Lutheran, no matter what. And if you want to be something else, you can. You just can't do it here. You have to leave, right? And that's very difficult to do, right? We're talking in most cases about German peasants who have lived on the same farm for hundreds and hundreds of years. Their families have been there. They have no way of knowing what happens if they move. Where would they move to? Nevertheless, it was possible for you to pick up and move to a Protestant country or to a Roman Catholic country or something like that. Well, this piece of legislation goes by the fancy Latin title Cuius Regio Eius Religio. Cuius Regio Eius Religio. And that's a phrase which is really difficult to translate into to English or Hindi, but it usually is translated as something like whose region, his religion, right? Whose region? His religion, right? Whoever owns the region, whoever controls the region, he's the one who gets to decide on the religion. Now, technically, according to the Peace of Augsburg, there were only two options: Roman Catholic and Lutheran. Right? That was it: Roman Catholic and Lutheran. However, there were a growing number of Reformed Protestants within the Holy Roman Empire, and in particular in territory known as the Palatinate, which happened to have one of the electors as the ruler. In the Palatinate, Reformed Protestantism began to grow, although technically it was illegal because it was not accepted as part of the Peace of Augsburg. Well, without going into too much detail, what ended up happening is that the solution that was proposed at the Peace of Augsburg, Cuius Regio Eius Religio, became the statement for the future. In 1618, after about 60 years of peace, religious warfare broke out again in the Holy Roman Empire. For 30 years, a truly apocalyptic struggle. It was a terrible, terrible war, the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. Here, Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Reformed fought, often Lutheran and Reformed fighting together as Protestants against the Roman Catholics. This war brought in almost all of the European powers to one degree or another. Scandinavian troops came in, French troops came in. Everyone was involved in this war, and it was terribly destructive. After 30 years of fighting, finally, at Westphalia, a peace statement was signed. The Peace of Westphalia basically left things at the same place that they had been 100 years ago at the Peace of Augsburg. Germany would continue to be divided religiously between Protestants, both Reformed and Lutheran, and Roman Catholics. And this would be the settlement. This would be the way that life would continue within the Holy Roman Empire for hundreds of years to continue to go on. Now, Germany, of course, Holy Roman Empire isn't the only place in Europe that was having political and religious struggles. In fact, as Protestantism spread throughout Europe, because it didn't triumph theologically everywhere, but only in some places, and because Roman Catholics couldn't root out Protestantism as they wanted to do, and because of the close alliance between church and state, the Christendom model, the result necessarily was lots of religious warfare. This was an era of religious warfare. Wars were fought when lesser magistrates and greater magistrates disagreed with one another. In particular, in Germany and France, where Protestant lesser magistrates found themselves at odds with their sovereign, whether an emperor or a king, who was Roman Catholic. In France, from 1562 to 1598, there were a whole series of wars of religions in which Protestant nobles and Huguenots, French Protestants are called Huguenots, Protestant nobles and Huguenots fought against the powers of the Roman Catholic monarch. And it wasn't until the end of the century, until 1598, that finally King Henry IV, who had originally been Protestant, but converted to Roman Catholicism, because he couldn't become king without becoming Roman Catholic. Henry IV promulgated what became known as the Edict of Nantes, or the Edict of Toleration. That is, he maintained Roman Catholicism as the official religion of France, but he tolerated, within certain limited scope, he tolerated Protestants. Now, 1598, the Edict of Nantes is promulgated by Henry IV, but over the next 100 years or so, until 1685, over the next 100 years or so, successive monarchs of Roman Catholic France would take away the privileges that had been given to Protestant Huguenot, and eventually in 1685, I think it's Louis the 13th. That doesn't sound right. Well, anyways, it's one of the Louis. Decides we just don't even need to have the Huguenot around anymore, and so he promulgates what he calls the Edict of Fontainebleau, and the Edict of Fontainebleau basically makes Protestantism illegal again. So now, if you are Protestant, you have to go somewhere else, or be arrested, or die. Elsewhere, in Spain and Portugal, in Italy, these were territories that remained pretty solidly Roman Catholic. Not entirely, but pretty solidly Roman Catholic. How did they do that? How did they maintain Roman Catholicism in those territories? By combining the power of church and state, right? Their church and state work together to root out Protestantism, and they do it effectively. By contrast, in places like England and Scotland, in the Netherlands and Scandinavia, way up in the north, Protestant rulers established Protestant churches. They established churches with Protestant systems of doctrine and Protestant liturgies. Sometimes they used the same sort of force that Roman Catholic magistrates had used to punish heretics within their territories. In places like England and Scandinavia, the king of those countries actually became the head of the church. The head of the church in England, even today, Queen Elizabeth II is not head of the church, but supreme governor of the church, So she maintains her authority over the Anglican Church. Again, in England, now back in the early modern period, in England, kings appointed bishops. They appointed archbishops. They refused to tolerate other religions, especially Roman Catholics and heretics, but also sometimes dissenting Protestants, right? Folks that we would think of as generally Orthodox, right? So Baptists, for example, Congregationalists, even Presbyterians like me, were persecuted at times. This relationship, right, the strong association, the alliance, what I'm calling the Christendom model, this establishment began to break up in Europe as a result of the Enlightenment. Because the Enlightenment, one of the things that it did was it divided life up into public and private spheres. Now, this was part of a much larger program, larger process of secularization that claimed to be approaching the world from a kind of a neutral perspective, right? They said religious perspectives are imbalanced. They're not objective. They are prejudiced, right? Instead, what we need is a neutral perspective. And from the Enlightenment point of view, public things that were true for everyone all the time, those were the things that were public. Those were the things that would be legislated, right? And these would be based on things that everybody could agree upon, things like reason, right? Science, math, and the conclusions that were drawn from them. So things like natural rights or natural law. This is real world, tangible stuff that makes a difference in our lives, so they say. But by contrast, the private things were the things that are kind of on the inside, right? Feelings, dreams, wishes, the conscience, and belief as well, right? Beliefs about God, in particular, were put into that private sphere. And the reason why that was the case is because although Christianity claimed to be a historic religion, right, in the sense that it is based on historic, objective facts, the resurrection of Christ is something that happened. However, because here we have to draw upon an Enlightenment thinker, a man named Lessing, right? In the 18th century, Lessing, thinking about history and thinking in particular about Christianity and the resurrection, said, you can't actually go back in the past. You can't actually experience the past directly. All that we can do is get to the past by a sort of a leap of faith. And so if you want to believe in Christianity, you can't actually go and experience the resurrection directly. You can't go and do that. That means that you can only get to the resurrection by a leap of faith. Historic Christianity for Lessing was not provable, right? He didn't mean to say by that it wasn't true. That wasn't the point. The point was that you couldn't prove it in those sort of public ways, by reason, by science, by math, right? You couldn't prove it in that way. And therefore, it was private. It wasn't something to build a society on. Instead, it's relegated to private life. Right? That's fine if you believe that, he might say, but don't tell me about your personal beliefs. I already have my own. And we live in a world, at least I live in a world, where we have this legacy. It is very impolite to discuss religion with someone, and even more to try and convert them to your own religion. So things like religious belief would be tolerated, but shouldn't be encouraged by the state, according to the Enlightenment understanding. And the result was that as the Enlightenment began to spread and as these ideas gained traction in different Western societies and eventually spread around the world, the result is that over the centuries, religion became sidelined. It became irrelevant to many people in Europe and increasingly in the West and in some other parts of the world. Now, this doesn't mean that religion is on the decline. That's a much more complicated discussion. But what it does mean is that organized religion, established religion, no longer becomes integral, central to the life of the state. Instead, by the 19th, 18th, 19th century, certainly into the 20th century, more and more states who once had established churches are beginning to embrace pluralism. They're embracing pluralism. They see that as more beneficial to the state than having a single religion. And most modern secular states have embraced this idea of toleration. It allows for the church to exist, of course, right? This toleration allows for the church to exist, even allows for it to spread. We can look, for example, at Article 26 of the Indian Constitution, something that grows out of this Enlightenment spirit, right? Transported into a very different context. Article 26 of the Indian Constitution says, subject to public order, morality, and health, every religious denomination or any section thereof shall have the right to establish and maintain institutions for religious and charitable purposes, to manage its own affairs in matters of religion, to own and acquire movable and immovable property, and to administer such property in accordance with the law. Notice the way this is structured. Subject to public order, morality, and health. Every religion, private, right? Public and private, even in the Indian Constitution. So this Enlightenment spirit of toleration allows for multiple religions to exist within societies. This has allowed Christianity to move into some areas where it would not be able to exist otherwise. It has allowed it to spread. This is a good thing, but this is always a dangerous position to be in. Right? When the political winds shift and the state finds that Christianity is objectionable for whatever reason, then we find ourselves having to make tough decisions. And again, we can connect this to the story in India. Veer Savarkar, 1883 to 1966. I'm sure I mispronounced his name, brothers. I apologize. A rationalist and an atheist, a Hindu nationalist, an ideology which sees all of those who consider India as their fatherland and holy land as true Hindus. Right? That is what it means to be Hindu. That is what it means to be Indian, is to consider India both your fatherland and your holy land, according to Savarkar. This, of course, excludes Christians and Muslims. So as that Enlightenment vision from the 1949 Constitution begins to give way and Hindu nationalism comes on the rise, now Christians and Muslims find themselves excluded. So while Enlightenment tolerance seems like a strong place for Christianity to spread, it comes with dangers. Why does it come with dangers? Because we don't belong in this world. This is the time, right, when those sorts of things happen. That's when we feel most acutely that we are pilgrims. We aren't citizens of this world, not ultimately. We're temporarily citizens of India or the United States. Ultimately, we are pilgrims sojourning in a land that is not our own. We're exiles on the way to a kingdom that cannot be shaken and that will endure forever. Now, we are probably going to find in these moments, when we find it uncomfortable to be in this world and citizens of earthly kingdoms, we're probably going to find it really useful to look to the examples of the early church, or to look to the examples of the persecuted church during the Reformation period. Look to the example of the French Huguenots who knew what it was like to suffer. We're also going to find good examples of how to live this life in the Old Testament, I think. And I'm thinking especially, of the patriarchs, right? Living among idolatrous neighbors. But even more, I'm thinking of the Jewish exiles, men like men like Daniel, men like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? The Jewish children who live at the court in Persia. Book of Esther, right? This would be another excellent place to go to. Jeremiah, right? The discussion that Jeremiah has, chapters 29 through 31 or so. These are good places for us to wrestle with as we think about what it looks like for us to live as Christians in this world. I would say that our situation is much more like theirs than it is like the Jews living in their promised land under Joshua or under King David. All right, as we move here towards a conclusion, let me just offer a few final comments, right? I think Christians certainly don't want to accept the Enlightenment settlement that makes religion just a personal matter, right? Not a matter of public importance, a personal matter, merely something that's on the inside because it's not something that affects the world out there. But on the other hand, we also don't want to create a Christian state in which all of our neighbors are forced to confess Christ or leave. Although that is an approach that some have taken. I think, for example, in the late 20th century in the United States, there was an effort known as Christian Reconstructionism, or sometimes it's called theonomy. The big figure here is a man named Rushdoony, R.J. Rushdoony, who died in 2001. And Rushdoony tried to apply Mosaic laws, Old Testament Mosaic laws, to modern society in order to create a good and godly society. I don't think that that was a good way to go, but he did make that effort. Or, from a very different perspective, the Pope, right? He continues very, very quietly, but he continues to maintain the claims of his predecessors that as the wielder of the spiritual sword, he has authority over the wielders of the temporal sword. He claims absolute authority over all rulers. I don't think that either the Enlightenment settlement or the Christendom settlement is the way to go. I think rather what we want to do is we want to understand the relationship between church and family and state and so forth. We want to understand that those have real world implications for how we live our lives in this present age. I think we need to recognize that these are not easy waters to navigate. But they're waters that we have to navigate, and we can only do it by faithfully resting and trusting on God. So may God give us wisdom as we seek to honor him as citizens of India and Nepal and of the United States, but also, and more importantly, as citizens of the heavenly kingdom of the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen, brothers.